Well, let me also say good morning and welcome to everyone. We are glad you're here, especially those of you who are guests, and we appreciate your being here for this special day. By now, some of you may realize that I have kind of a weird sense of humor. And so I found it humorous that in the bulletin, the men's movie night movie today is Shawshank Redemption, about escaping prison on the day we're celebrating being out of the imprisonment of debt. Maybe that's not funny to anybody else, but it was funny to me. So it's a good day. And when we go outside at the conclusion of the service and burn the mortgage, and Glenn Howell we're going to give Glenn the torch. That's a little scary. We'll have several official words out there, but our focus on the services inside the building today is not so much our being debt-free, but about this place being dedicated to God. And so as I thought about that, I remembered that the Celtic Christians in what we now call Ireland, that they had an interesting concept of spirituality. One of their concepts is that there are thin places in the world. The ancient Celtic Christians in Ireland believe that there's a barrier that exists between us and God, but they believe that there are places in the world where that barrier is thin or easily transfixed. And they believe that when you want to feel closer to God, you should go to one of those thin places. And in particular, they believe that children know the way. I'll come back to that point a little bit later. So if you want to know more about Celtic spirituality, it's really quite fascinating what we have drawn from them. There's lots of good books. One of them is called The Mist-Filled Path, Celtic Wisdom for Exiles, Wanderers, and Seekers by Frank McCowan, nice Irish name. But it leads me to wonder, well, where are those thin places and holy places in your life and in mine? So I made my little list of some of the places that in my life I have found myself able to draw closer to God. One of them is church camp, particularly Epworth Forest. You've heard me talk about that before, where I first publicly affirmed my faith and later felt called into ministry. Something about that place when I go there still, I go there and I just feel closer to God because of what has happened in that place. There's certain times I've been to the seashore or the lakeside where just being along and seeing the waves and hearing the gentle hush of all of that and the birds and occasionally a dolphin jumping or something, somehow at those moments, I feel closer to God. And likewise, mountaintops. I've been to various places in the world that are pretty high. I remember one time traveling up the Zugspitze in Switzerland, up in the Alps, and we had to take a cog train up the side of the mountain. As the farther up we went, the more I felt, wow, something about the majesty of God is revealed here, and I felt closer to God. I've made several trips to the Holy Land, and for me, Jerusalem's great and all that, but the Sea of Galilee is it. When you go to the Sea of Galilee, and it's still the same thing it was when Jesus walked along those shores, something about being there and walking those shores and seeing where he likely gave the Sermon on the Mount and all that, I just felt closer to God. Maybe an odd one on the list is my grandparents' home. I may need to explain that a little bit. My grandparents, the Coyners, lived in Colfax in Indiana, a little tiny town in Clinton County, not terribly far from here. And my sister and I would always spend some time there each summer. And there was something about that place, particularly I remember after what they called supper. Dinner was the main meal of the day at noon, because they were a farm family, but in the evening was supper. After supper, we would gather in what they called the parlor. It was really just kind of a back room. And my grandfather would sit at his big roll-top desk, which I have inherited. It's one of my favorite things. And he would do work, but he always had in the little door opening underneath the cupboard, he had metal toys for us grandkids to play with. I have those metal toys still. But my grandmother, meanwhile, would sit in her rocking chair across the room with the family Bible on her lap. And from my perspective as a little kid, I didn't think she was doing much. She would close her eyes and rock, read a couple verses, close her eyes and rock. And I remember more than once saying to her, "Grandma, what are you doing?" And her answer would always be, "I'm recollecting. I'm recollecting." Now, it was only later in life I began to understand that. For one thing, she was regathering her strength after chasing grandkids around all day. Been there, done that. She was remembering, but she was also praying and kind of reconnecting with God. And I didn't really understand it as a little boy, but what I understood was this was a holy place. Because my grandma, at least, was finding this would be a place to draw closer to God. And of course, on the list is church, both my home church and a lot of churches I've served and been in and out of. My point is that there are places in life, I know God is available everywhere, but there's places in life we go there, in part, I think, because we need those places. We need places, special places, holy places, what the Celts called thin places, to help us be open to God. So today, as we're dedicated, in a sense, rededicating this building to God now that it's paid for, that's what we're praying for. We're praying that this place, this building we enjoy, would be more than just a gathering place, more than just something for us and our activities. We're praying that God will use this place as a holy place, as a thin place, if you will, as a place where people can come and draw closer to God. Because you see, you never know who's going to need the ministry of this space. Several years ago, I was conducting a funeral in a church where the grandfather had been originally the pastor who built that building, and now his little granddaughter, who was born prematurely and didn't make it, I was doing her funeral. She had just lived a few days. We gathered in that church, and the funeral was not an easy one, as you can imagine. But afterwards, we stood around and visited in the sanctuary like you do after church. And the grandfather, retired pastor, came up to me and he said, I was a pastor here when we built this building. I said, yeah, I know you were. And he said, I never dreamed it would be needed for my own granddaughter's funeral. Wow. But then he said something I've always remembered. He said, but that's what happens when you give a place over to God. You never know who will need the ministry of this place. I think he's got it exactly right. So as we think about this place, I'd like you to imagine with me, who's going to need the ministry of this place over the next, let's say, 100 years? How many youth will be confirmed here, like we're going to do next week and confirm youth? How many babies will be baptized in this very place? How many marriages will be conducted in this place? How many loved ones will be memorialized and remembered in this place? How many prayers will be offered in this place? How many songs of praise to God will be offered in this place? And if you think of the whole building, then how many children over the years will come to this place to learn about God's love and their friend Jesus in their lives? How many youth will come here to find acceptance and hope? How many adult classes will meet here? How many cups of coffee will we spill on the carpet? Sorry, trustees, but it happens. When we dedicate this building today and we give it over to God to be a holy place, a thin place, what we're saying is, God, we don't know who all will need the ministry of this place, but we believe you, oh God, will use this place and make it into a holy place. We hope, oh God, that when new people walk in the door, they'll just sense, that God is here, that this is a holy place. I think that's what the Celtic Christians meant in Ireland when they talked about thin places. Now, they didn't say this, but I believe if there's thin places, there must also be thin people. I don't mean thin people, but I mean people in whose presence we feel closer to God. Isn't it true? Every church I've ever served and every church I've ever visited as a traveling bishop going around, I have noticed that there are people that other people are drawn to because those people, they're thin people. They're people for whom the barrier between them and God seems very thin, and they just seem like they are aware of God's presence in their life. Now, one of the characteristics of such people is they're very humble. So if you were to say to somebody in this congregation, you're just a saintly person here, oh, no, not me. Because one of the characteristics of being a thin person is the humility that says, oh, no, I'm not any better than anybody else. But the rest of us say, we see in you and we feel in your presence that you're someone who's closer to God. That's what those halos meant in all those old paintings. I never used to be too fond of that idea. I mean, who wants to go around wearing a halo? But an art professor said to me one day, he said, "You're looking at it wrong. It's not that anybody puts on a halo. The halo is meant to say that when you look at that person, you see the light of Christ in their life. That's what the halo means." And I would guess if we would make a little list today, several of you could name others in this congregation, and some of you would name each other and say, "You know, when I'm near that person, I just feel closer to God." The gospel reading that Cindy read reminds us from the words of Jesus that all of us are called to be salt and light in the world. All of us are called to be and can be people. Through our actions, through our love, for our very life, people say, "I see something of God in that person, and I want to be closer to them and to that church they're a part of." Now, I mentioned that the Celts believe that children know the way, and that was very much a part of their thinking. That if you want to get closer to God, you follow children around, you see where children go and spend their time, and you learn from the kids. I don't know about exactly how that works. All I can tell you in my travels as a bishop supervising lots of churches and being in lots of churches really all over the world. The other day I counted up, I've been in 26 countries and United Methodist churches there. What I have noticed is that when you walk in a church and you see a church that does a lot of ministry with children, those churches always have life and spirit and a sense of God's presence. And this church is blessed, I believe, and keeps its focus correctly upon lots and lots of ministry to lots and lots of children, and that's a good thing, because children somehow remind us of the pathway to God. So I read a story recently. I don't know if it's one of those real stories or one of those things that just makes the rounds on Facebook, but I like the story. And this story was about a family that had a little boy who was 4 or 5 years old, and then they had a baby sister. And baby sister came home from the hospital, and everybody gathered to celebrate the baby sister, and big brother, was kind of feeling off to the side. But finally, as things settled down with all the celebration of the baby sister, the father noticed that big brother was standing over the crib whispering to baby sister. And being a little concerned about what this big brother might be saying to baby sister, he kind of sneaked over to hear what he was saying to her. And here's what he heard big brother saying: "Can you tell me what God looks like? I'm starting to forget." Can you tell me what God looks like? I'm starting to forget. Well, we adults start to forget sometimes. We forget what it means to live our life aware of the presence of God. But children can help us out. They may not do it and say it in words that are deeply theological, but somehow hanging around with children and being a part of a church that reaches out to children, we can find our way to God as well. So today, we're going to dedicate this space to God. And following the dedication time in here, we're going to sing a closing hymn and say a unison prayer together. Then we're going to go outside, and there's cookies on the way to entice you. But we're going to go outside. There's a stage set up out there in the oval area, and there'll be people doing and saying different things. So kind of gather around the stage. If you need a place to sit down during that 10 or 15 minutes of time, there's some chairs as well. But it looks like it's a pretty nice day. When we planned this date, we kept saying, "I sure hope it doesn't snow again in April." So it should be a good day. We have different people involved in doing different things today, but most importantly, all of us have a role in praying for this place and saying we want to dedicate this place to God. We want to give this space over to God and say to God, this is not just for us, this building we built. And having it paid off is freeing for us, but what it's really freeing for is to allow us to say to you, oh God, take this space, make it yours, and make it a place where everyone can draw closer to God. So at this point, I'm going to invite Jillian to come forward. You already had her introduced. Jillian's going to come to the lectionary. Jillian was a little baby, was the first baby baptized once you moved into this new sanctuary. She's now a sophomore in high school, becoming very grown up. She's going to lead us. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you had a boot on your foot and you got to walk up here. It's not easy being a young person in this church, I guess, huh? Jillian's going to lead us in the act of dedication. It's printed in your bulletins. The R is where we respond to each sentence she offers, and we together will say, we dedicate this house. So Jillian will lead us through this, and then we'll stand and sing the church's one foundation. Jillian, please lead us.
Dear friends, now that we have completed this building and paid all indebtedness on it, let us dedicate this building and rejoice in its holy use. To the glory of God, who called us by grace, to the honor of Jesus Christ, who loved us and gave himself for us, to the praise of the Holy Spirit, who illumines and sanctifies us. For the worship of God, in prayer and praise, for the preaching of the everlasting gospel, for the celebration of the holy sacraments. For the comfort of all who mourn, for the strength to those who are tempted, for the light to those who seek the way. For the howling of family life, for the teaching and guiding the young, for the perfecting of the saints. For the conversion of sinners, for the promotion of righteousness, for the extension of God's reign. In the unity of faith, in the bond of brotherhood and sisterhood, in love and goodwill to all. In gratitude for the labors of all who love and serve this church, in loving remembrance of those who have finished their course, in hope of eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord.